So in this video, I want to address the concept of victim blaming, and I want to get into the psychology of people who are victim blamers. What is going on there that victim blaming is such a common thing? And if you've noticed in my recent videos, I'm tending to do this thing, not on purpose, but breaking things up into two different categories, like a dichotomy. Like the last video, people who love or hate the president. I had the video of people who wallow in their emotions or suppress their emotions. That was sort of a dichotomy. So I'm basically speaking about these broad patterns of psychology in the United States. This may apply if you're outside the US. I just can't really speak for that. I don't live there. I haven't seen what's actually happening there. But I definitely think this plays into people's politics, which is interesting because it's just pure psychology. So, and even trauma is involved here a lot of the time. So we're kind of going to do this thing again of like people who blame victims and people who get really mad at those people who are blaming victims, right? So I'm just going to start with a basic example, something that was in the news a lot over the past few years, past 5 years or so, and that's the idea of women and sexual assault. That is a big issue that I think has brought this victim blaming thing to the surface because it was very polarizing. We have the people who say, if you're a female and you go out late at night, then you're just asking for something bad to happen to you. If you're dressed a certain way, you deserve to be assaulted. I'm sorry if this is like triggering for some people, but that is kind of, the mentality. And then we have people who are just on the opposite side of things that are just completely outraged at that perspective. They call it victim blaming. Rightfully so. That is what it is. So where is this mentality coming from? Because this is such a triggering issue, especially in the case of, assault victims, people tend to look at victim blamers as just purely evil people, like they're just terrible and that's that. I understand that perspective. I'm going to provide a different perspective. So again, if this is a really triggering topic for you, this is not me taking the side of victim blamers or anything of that nature. This is just me laying out my personal understanding, my personal theory of what I believe victim blaming, where it originates in the human psyche. That's all that I'm saying here. So, okay, so let's start with I want to talk about something that I'm just going to call the anger mechanism. So anger is a feeling that pulls people out of powerless states. So if you have something like shame, guilt, fear, apathy, grief, depression, anxiety, anything like that, those are all disempowering states in comparison to anger. Anger is an action-oriented energy. It is aimed at pulling you out of these powerless states. The go-to of people who don't know how to feel better about their lower negative emotions, the go-to when they're feeling really desperate is to bounce up into anger. So anger is up here. Everything else is beneath that we typically experience as negative. Anger is, you can think of anger as the most positive negative emotion because it is the first point at which you start to feel that power is possible. Victim blamers are saying that victims had power and control in their situation. So if they're saying it's your fault, they're saying there's something you could have done, you were in control, and so don't play the victim, you're not a victim. This is a direct window into the psyche of the victim blamer and how they treat themselves. period. That is all this is. So when a victim blamer sees someone who is claiming to be a victim, it is a trigger for them to go into anger because the rest of it feels too bad. Now, why would they even care? Why would this even be relevant? Like, if you see someone on the news who's a victim of something, why would that trigger you? Why would you get involved in that emotionally? Why would you need to bounce up into anger and blame them and say that they're not victims? The only reason that would ever happen is if this was actually about what had happened to the victim blamer in their life. The victim blamer is watching the news, they see a victim, they think it's your fault. They believe that they're talking about the victim. They believe that that's what they're really talking about. But this anger mechanism that I just talked about, where you feel a negative state and you instantly get pulled up into anger so that you feel better, that is an instant survival mechanism in your body, in your nervous system. So the victim blamer does not see that happen. They don't see that they're pulled right up into anger because they were almost feeling fear, shame, grief, whatever they almost had to feel. They avoided it they avoided having to feel it, and they jumped right to anger. Because they don't know this is happening, it's all subconscious. I don't even know if I'd say subconscious. It's almost like instinctual. It's a survival pattern. Believe it or not, victim blaming is a survival pattern. So to be clear, I'm not saying that the victim blamer feels bad for the victim and bounces up into anger so that they don't have to feel bad for the victim. It's not even that. It's that the mentality of the victim blamer, the way that they have stayed alive and dealt with their own traumas, is to instantly, automatically, subconsciously assume that they must have actually been in control of the situation and they just made a mistake, or they should have known better, or whatever the case. This is the mental framework that helps them avoid having to face their own victimhood, which is their own powerlessness. What has likely happened to the victim blamer in their life is exactly this, okay? They grew up, bad things happened to them, whether that is related to sexual assault or just something totally different. Bad things happened to them. They had no means of coping with those things. So their psyche automatically made it into this idea that it must have been their fault, right? This is like a common thing people talk about. When people have trauma, they often feel like it's their fault. We usually don't think of victim blamers as people who are suffering with this because we're too busy being angry at them for being awful. But this is actually what they are dealing with. They are dealing with this idea that the trauma that they have endured is their fault. Now, stay with me. This is not simply about getting them to realize that it wasn't their fault. The reason that they're grasping onto the idea that it was their fault is related to, remember I said we don't want to feel the lower things, we bounce up into anger. So they're holding on to this mentality because it's helping them feel better, right? So internally, are they blaming themselves for what has happened to them? Probably, very highly likely that they are. So how do you change the perception of the victim blamer? Most people just try to yell at them and tell them that they're awful for treating other people this way. While that's understandable, and I can see how that would be very triggering for someone who has been a victim of a lot of things and they're getting yelled at by this random person who's blaming them and saying it's all their fault, yelling at victim blamers does nothing but send them deeper into their spiral. So what actually has to be done is quite complicated. It involves convincing the victim blamer that, so for step 1, convincing the victim blamer that A, it was not their fault, the traumas that they have endured were not their fault, there's nothing they could have done about it, and they were truly victims. So convincing the victim blamer that they were in fact victims of the things that have happened to them in their life. This isn't going to go over well with them because that forces them to go into these really painful states of powerlessness. Now, they don't want to do that because that is such an antagonistic idea to any human mind. Every human mind has major resistance to that idea. Victim blamers, they deal with it in this particular way. So this is how it plays out for them. So victim blamers don't know that when they process what is beneath the anger, they can move on with their lives and experience real power, not anger empowerment, that temporary like adrenaline rush, but real power that is way, way, way above anger. It makes anger unnecessary when you have real power. So the victim blamers don't know this state of mind exists. So they're really, really attached to their anger, which, like I said, when they see a victim on the news or whatever, they're triggered to go into that anger. So we need to convince them to let go of what has helped them survive. That's why they're so resistant, because this has been their only mechanism. Pulling themselves up into anger has been their only mechanism for feeling better at all. So the fact that they blame themselves for their trauma may have literally kept them alive and going. This is what nobody knows about victim blamers. Like, I've literally never heard anyone speak of this because it's so counterintuitive, so buried deep in there that nobody even notices this is going on. The victim blamer has no idea this is going on. The people who hate them have no idea this is going on. So we have to convince them that A, they should be working through the emotions that feel very, very, very bad. Everything under anger, right? Powerlessness, fear, shame, guilt, grief, depression. There may be a long grieving period for people who are processing their trauma, especially like really severe trauma. Another thing I want to mention is that nowadays, victim blaming is very taboo. I would say it's generally frowned upon, at least by lots of people. Now, go back, and this is a result of human evolution, by the way. The fact that victim blaming is no longer acceptable in most circles, most people look down on this, that is a symptom of the human psyche evolving and saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't think this is actually working. This is not benefiting people. Or there's a better way, essentially. Maybe it was benefiting people at one point, but there is a better way. Now, go back 50 to 100 years ago. So people who are today adult victim blamers, go back to when they were growing up and their psyche was being formed in early childhood. Victim blaming was the go-to back then. It was like the thing. And again, it's because people prefer to feel powerful. People prefer to not look at any aspect of their life in which they are a victim. So if you don't struggle with victim blaming at all, you are probably willing to look at the ways in which you are a victim. Now, the opposite end of that spectrum is people who feel like a victim constantly. Like, the other extreme is, people who can't seem to get out of their victimhood. Everything that happens to them, they feel like they're a victim of it. They're in the opposite of this problem. So people who are my age, millennials, did not grow up in a time where parenting practices were about victim blaming. my generation, generally speaking, this is not everybody, I'm just very generally speaking here. Please don't latch on to this as like everything all the time. But generally speaking, millennials, people my age, grew up during a time when victim blaming was less of a thing and people were more, I don't want to say coddled because that's such a negative term that people throw as like a shameful thing, but people were sort of more embraced. People had a longer childhood in a sense. Like you were allowed to be a child, essentially is what I'm saying. Millennials were allowed to be children. So there was less victim blaming on that generation, at that generation, as they grew up, simply because, evolution, human evolution. Each generation that comes learns something new and it gets passed on, usually unconsciously. Like people aren't even thinking about this or talking about this. But as baby boomers achieved a more stable quality of life, so baby boomers, they grew up during the time where there was more victim blaming. Everything was your fault. Like even in the education system, like when boomers grew up, teachers and parents abusing kids was way more acceptable. It was fine. It was almost no big deal to a lot of families. Nobody saw it as abuse. They called it discipline. And boomers will like stand on this soapbox. Not all, sometimes, just sometimes. Not all baby boomers, but many will stand on this soapbox of we were tough. When we grew up, nobody was coddled. Nobody got anything. And it's really a source of pride for them because it's the only way that they can access that pride. And when they see people who are victims, either real victims or even especially people who are like playing victim, who maybe like nothing super terrible happened to them, but they're just playing victim, like they're stuck in that mentality. Boomers, again, not all, some, they will get very angry because they're looking at all their trauma and how they got out of it, and everything this victim is doing is flying in the face of how they survived. So they weren't allowed to talk about it, they weren't allowed to have feelings, they weren't allowed to go to therapy, they weren't allowed to have anything. It was just their fault. So that is where all of this resistance comes from. So we have this surge of people right now claiming to be victims of things because they're trying to move out of their victimhood. So women in sexual assault, that is something that had to come to consciousness. That could not have stayed unconscious. We cannot have an entire half of the population dealing with being sexual assault victims and that being commonplace, and men never, ever, ever having to face that, right? And of course, this happens to men too. Men are assaulted too sometimes. So assault is a big issue. We have race issues, people claiming, people who are victims of racial injustice. We have trans people. We have, homophobia going on. We have all these different forms of oppression. And all these people claiming to be victims because they are victims in those particular ways. And they're claiming to be victims because it feels good to be honest. It feels good to start claiming, like, this is what is really happening to me. I am moving up out of this. Now, some people do get stuck in that victim phase forever. But generally speaking, the best thing for a victim of something to do is to voice it, admit it, talk about it, and go through the stages of grief, anger. They move up the scale, right? They feel the shame, guilt, fear, oh my God, it was my fault. They feel all that. Then they will naturally start to feel the anger. This happens naturally. If you let this happen in your body, it happens naturally. So once they feel the anger, they can then move out of the anger and no longer be victims. They cease to be victims. They have completely healed that aspect. So that is what people are trying to do right now, people who are speaking out about being victims in various ways. I don't think that everyone who's doing that knows how to move up that scale, but at least they're in that process. They're trying, you know. And again, it's because this is more prevalent in millennials because we have been given the space to do so. It was not as stigmatized as we grew up to be a victim of something. We were a little bit more coddled, as they say. And that's not a good or bad thing. That's a symptom of human evolution, right? So boomers were not brought up, generally speaking, in that environment. And so they are much more resistant to that idea. They don't see how claiming to be a victim could possibly lead to empowerment. And it really can. It's just a step it's a step in the process. So, hopefully that explains victim blaming, a little bit about victim mentality, and maybe I'll do another video about how to move out of victim mentality, which is kind of like the opposite spectrum, the opposite side of the spectrum. And also, so I have a course that I created that is about this scale of consciousness that I keep talking about, moving up to anger, shame, guilt, fear, all those emotions. I have a course about this. I took it down because I want to fix some things in it, but I will eventually be putting that course back up. It's a course called Cartography of Consciousness. It's about exploring each of these levels of the human psyche and how to move through them to get up to, more positive states of consciousness on a regular basis. So if you're interested in that, that will eventually be up in the hopefully next month or so, couple months. And that is it. So thank you for watching. I will see you next time.